We're going to get rolling here. All right, there's your motivational quote for the day. Seems like we've had some other ones that are similar to that. I didn't find any of these, so if I ever find one, I'll own it. But think of today as your next great opportunity. Hopefully, it's not an impossible situation. So we're going to go into resistance training today. We'll probably get through most of this set of slides today. We might have a little bit left over for the next time. And then next time we're going to tie in PNF, using PNF for resistance. We already did some of the PNF stretching techniques, but we'll incorporate some of the strengthening techniques next week. Lab this week should be pretty fun. Just have a chance to kind of explore these different types of resistance training activities. Make sure you can wrap your head around how to make things concentric, eccentric, closed chain, open chain, how to instruct people properly in what they should be feeling, what they need to be protecting against if you notice that they're doing things incorrectly. So hopefully you'll enjoy it. We'll have kind of two separate sessions, but both of them are going to be pretty heavily involved with you trying to instruct your partner in proper form and proper being able to explain the goals of these different types of activities as well. So if you have an exercise science background, hopefully this will all be review today, or the vast majority of it should be review for you. Lots of objectives. We'll kind of go through them as we go through all of our different concepts for this chapter. All right, so why do we want to do resistance exercise? Got this huge laundry list of things shown there, most of which are important for us just in general, for our own health and well-being. But certainly when we look at patients that are suffering from, orthopedic injuries, neurological injuries, progressive diseases that cause limitations in their ability to generate force, all sorts of weird connective tissue disorders, immune system function disorders, really pretty much any patient that we see, just about, with the exception of maybe a wound care patient, that's all we're doing on them. We're going to be including some type of resistance activity. Otherwise, they wouldn't need therapy. They're having some sort of weakness, some sort of loss of control, coordination, function. And so we can make a lot of positive influence on their recovery by choosing the right kind of resistance exercise for them to do based on where they are in their disease process, in their healing timeline, and all those things. So, like I say, lots and lots of things to work on, and lots of reasons why we want to do resistance activity. The general health recommendations that I think are consistent with CDC, and I'm trying to think of what other organizations have kind of vouched for them, is that average adults should be doing resistance exercise at least two times a week for all the major muscle groups in the body. And then they recommend doing aerobic activity at least 3 days a week. Depends on your intensity for both of those things, but it is something that we should all really try to work into our lifestyle on a regular basis to try and really just keep ourselves healthy and do things like this third bullet point: maintain that bone density that we need, maintain having good strong connective tissue, so when we are faced with a challenge of having to perform some physical feat, we're not going to just tear and shred our bodies apart, because we're going to be able to handle those forces. We're kind of used to it, and we've been putting those stresses through the body on a regular basis. That last bullet point, anti-aging, certainly when we get older, they've done lots of studies on the ability of people to remain functional into their elderly years, and maintaining strength, doing regular resistance exercise has been pretty much shown to be the strongest way to keep people from suffering frailty type injuries, whether that's compression fractures, whether that's things like falls. Um, but it definitely makes a big difference in keeping that person in the home longer. Um, those little things that we lose the ability to do, getting up and down from beds, getting up and down from chairs, getting off the ground if we happen to fall down, all those things are much easier if we do have sufficient strength um, relative to our body size as we get older. And most people will lose a lot of muscle mass over the course of their lifetime, particularly as we start getting older and less active in general. So these definitions, many of these we've kind of talked about already. Certainly muscle strength, that's basically just our maximum ability to generate force for a given motion, a given muscle group, um, however you want to look at it. Um, this term strength training, sometimes just called resistance training, also is just the way that we're going to specifically try to improve things like our strength, our muscular endurance, our power, depending on how we structure that. We can, vary loads versus reps versus speed of movement, all those kind of 5 drum components to try and more specifically target improving strength, improving power, or improving muscle endurance, or sometimes a little bit of all three. But the more specific you can create your training programs, the more you can really try and get the most bang for your buck for one of those 3 components. So power is basically how much force we can generate times how far we're moving that object, whether that object is us or external weight that we're putting on, and then we divide that by time. So speed is really critical for helping generate max power. And then endurance, we can either have multiple reps or we sustain contraction for a long period of time, and both of those would be ways to quantify muscle endurance. All right, a lot of these principles I think we talked about early in the semester. I think some of them may have a little bit more detail, but our overload principle basically is that in order to keep improving, we have to keep increasing the challenge. As we adapt and are able to more easily meet whatever challenge we're imposing on our body, whether that's a resistance challenge, a flexibility challenge, an endurance challenge, if we want to keep improving that component of fitness, we need to keep pushing the boundaries. We can't just, if we keep doing the same thing, you'll get good at doing that same thing, and you'll often improve your muscle endurance and cardiovascular endurance, but you won't necessarily improve those strength and power components nearly as much unless you keep, like I say, trying to do a little bit more. And that little bit more can be an extra set, can be an extra few reps, it can be an extra 5 pounds. So those are some of the common like 5 drum variables that we can bump up to make that overload principle stay in effect. And the more you push yourself as you get higher to your overall potential, then the overload, it takes more and more of a challenge to make any kind of big jump. Certainly when you're really deconditioned, you have a lot of room for improvement. So we'll see a pretty rapid increase a lot of times, especially when we look at somebody that's never done resistance training. But then they'll kind of stall out, and it takes a lot more diligence and consistency to continue to see those type of improvements. But for a lot of our patients, they're gonna respond pretty quickly and start showing pretty big improvements in strength within a short period of time, particularly if they haven't done much or have been pretty immobile for a while. Our SAID principle, sometimes called the specificity principle, and that is really just the idea that in order to get better at doing a certain thing, we need to do that certain thing, and we need to keep applying the overload principle to the specific component that we're trying to show the most adaptations in. We definitely we want the motion that we're having the person train with be very similar to what they're going to need when they face the challenges in their own life. So down at the bottom in this picture, we've got this person jumping up to block at the net in volleyball. They show the woman over here jumping basically with the arms up, trying to replicate what they would potentially need to do to get that block. Now she's starting with her arms down low and finishing with her arms down low, and that gives you more momentum and ability to jump higher, certainly. But there's a lot of times, if you've ever, watched volleyball, where those players will stand there with their hands up really the whole time. So you probably also need to, if we want to make it very specific, then we want to also have them train jumping with their arms up in the air, where they don't have the advantage of getting that arm swing to get their momentum and assist. Same thing with basketball. When you look at players fighting for rebounds, most of the time they're not bringing their arms down to their side. When they're in a lot of traffic, there's not room to swing your arms that way. So they kind of have to be willing and able to jump effectively while their arms are already overhead. And it is, it's both jumping, but it is different in how you're going to recruit the individual muscle fibers that help you accomplish that movement. Um, that position change is very relevant, and we need to kind of train both ways, because you want that person in a sport to be pretty adaptable and be able to respond in both situations, whether they have the ability to get that arm swing or a running start and jump, or whether they're basically jumping from a standstill with their arms already up over their head. Reversibility principle. It is basically the use it or lose it principle. I like this cartoon. Didn't use it and lost it. So I've tried to be pretty active my whole life, and there's been times when I have slacked off on resistance training in my adult years, whether it's motivation, whether it's lack of access to heavier weights and things like that. Um, and you notice a big difference when you don't do something for a period of months, or years potentially even, and you come back into that activity and start trying to get back into it. It's a challenge, and the older you get, the harder it is to regain and get back to where you used to be. So my single best advice is to keep using it, or you will lose it. Once you quit doing things, it's really hard to get them back. And when you're 20, you may take it for granted, but when you're 40, you recognize that really quickly, and when you're 50 or 60, you recognize it even more quickly. Um, once you get out of shape, it's a lot harder to get back in shape. If you can just stay in shape, then you're way better off in so many regards. So stay active. Um, if you're not doing any type of resistance work, I would highly recommend starting doing something now. And it doesn't need to be, heavy squats, heavy deadlifts, heavy bench press, anything like that. Just you need to do something where you're overloading your muscles so that you give yourself a challenge and continue to respond and at least maintain and be able to tread water where your fitness levels are right now, but hopefully continue to actually improve. Because most of you are young and have a lot of potential to continue to get in better shape and get stronger and get more fit. And the higher you can get in your young years, then you got a lot farther to drift down before you lose function as you start getting older. When you're just barely holding on, when you're 30, 40, 50, then when you hit 60, 70, 80, well, you're already close to being losing function. So definitely try and reach for the skies when it comes to that, especially when you're jumping, because, yeah, Alan?
I also think that if some kind of freak accident happens, like what happened with me last year, that exercising regularly produces more neuromuscular pathways and blood vessels and all those things, that if something, with your heart or brain does happen, then you have more pathways, for the body to, I guess you have a greater chance of healing, is what I'm trying to say.
You have a greater chance of healing, and you have a greater chance of surviving too, especially when we look at circulatory changes that come with training. If we can, if we have one primary blood vessel that's supplying a given body part or a given organ and it starts getting blocked, if we've been training on a regular basis, we've created collateral circulation, extra pathways for that blood to flow. And so it can literally save your life by having challenge your body on a regular basis and made it more adaptable. And when it comes to neurological pathways, if you do only the same movements all the time, then your array of motor plans and motor programs to accomplish tasks are more limited too. Whereas if you do things in a variety of ways, different angles, different positions, one-legged, both legs, all those type of things, then when you do, have a neurological injury, brain injury or stroke or something that affects certain pathways, again, you may have some other things available to you that still might let you accomplish things in a functional and safe way, um, even if you're not able to rehab enough to get back that primary motor pathway that you had used and been reliant on as the kind of the go-to way that we're going to accomplish a given movement. So for sure, can definitely make a difference with that. All right. So our ability to generate force is dependent on a lot of different things, and we've got about half a dozen factors kind of listed there. Size is for sure the most important thing, and they've done studies looking at males and females, and the ability of a muscle to generate force is most highly correlated with this cross-sectional area. And so it doesn't matter if a man's thigh is the same muscle mass around cross-sectional area as a female's thigh, both types of muscle are capable of producing just as much force. Men on average can generate more force because they tend to have more muscle mass. But all things being equal, if the muscle mass is the same size, then the force producing capability is essentially exactly the same with that. So when we train on a regular basis, we do have the ability to increase the size of our muscles, and that's going to help you be able to generate more force. Certainly our fiber type makes a big difference. Our type 1 is our slow twitch. Our type 2A is kind of our intermediate. And then our type, what some books call 2B and others call 2X, is kind of our most powerful, most explosive. So both the 2A and the 2BX are fast twitch muscle fiber types. The B/X is the most explosive type. The A is believed to be the most versatile in that if you do more resistance training, it's going to kind of lean towards functioning and having the enzyme qualities as the type 2Bs. But if you do a lot more endurance activities, then your 2As will tend to create more enzymes that help with aerobic metabolism and prolonged activity. So those are the most easily adaptable and the most trainable fibers. And the fiber type we have is largely genetically determined. It's what mom and dad's genetic mix give you at birth. And you can't really, most researchers don't think you can really change a significant amount of muscle fiber type, if at all. So you're kind of stuck with what you got. So if you're slow or weak, you can kind of partially blame your parents, but you can still maximize your potential. So don't put it all on them. Of course, they can just blame your grandparents too. So the blame game never ends with that route. So take it upon yourself to just do whatever you can do within your own capabilities to get better. Length tension relationship certainly can play a big role. If we put our muscles in a good position to generate force, they're going to have an easier time generating a lot of force. And so typically if we're at maximal too lengthened position or too shortened of a position, we tend to be a little bit weaker in those. And if you think about like doing squats, if you're doing a heavy amount of weight trying to do a squat, you don't go as deep as you can. You don't try, you basically usually are recommended to just try and stop when your femurs are about parallel to the ground. If we go down into that really, really deep squat where our butt's almost hitting the ground and we have a lot of knee flexion, it's hard to get back up if you've got much load. And a lot of that is because the length tension relationship between all those different muscle groups that are involved in that squatting motion is not as powerful when we're really, really lengthened in that full hip flexion, full knee flexion type position at the bottom of a unweighted kind of squat motion. So that's just kind of one example of where that comes into play. Now, motor unit recruitment has a lot to do with strengthening and our ability to generate force, and that's really the first thing that comes back, or the first thing that people gain when they start adding in resistance training. They'll get a lot stronger pretty quickly, even without their muscles getting any bigger, because they start learning how to make the specific motor units that they need to accomplish a lift fire at the right time in a given movement. And so we'll see really rapid improvements in strength many times in the first 2, 3, 4 weeks, and the person hasn't put on any muscle mass. We haven't seen the longer term physiological changes that go about with resistance training, where we actually generate more protein and thicken up the actin and myosin and those things, that takes a lot more time. But our ability of our brain to sense through our sensory system what the weight feels like that we're picking up and how we need to activate more and more motor units in a given muscle group or groups to move that body, that extra weight that we put onto the body, is what we really get better at quickly. And especially when we look at patients that have, neurological problems, then we really need to try and maximize that ability. We need to help them regain control first. Once they start getting at least some semblance of basic motion and control, then we can start thinking about challenging the load a little bit. Sometimes we're not even looking at adding resistance, we're just trying to improve movement. And just by moving the weight of the digits and limbs and things like that, that can be a form of light strengthening, but it's mostly about helping the brain and the muscles better reconnect and recognize what they need to do to work together to accomplish motions. Now, our type of contractions, what are our three types? Hopefully you can read the slide over there. They're kind of shown there. Yeah.
Isometric.
Concentric and eccentric, isometric.
Okay, so there we go. Iso, con, and eccentric. Isometric, we're not moving. We're basically just generating force against a resistance, but without really causing motion. With concentric, we are lifting the body or the weight against the forces of gravity, typically. Certainly we can use other types of resistance too, but if you think about lifting a body weight or doing a push-up or a pull-up or a squat or anything like that, we're moving against gravity when we look at concentrics. And then eccentric, we're lowering that weight. Now, we can generate the most force eccentrically. And it relates time to the speed of contraction too. When they've done studies looking at force generating capabilities of muscles, when we're contracting eccentrically rapidly, that's when we're the most capable of generating the highest peak forces in a given muscle group. Concentric contractions are a little different. When we're trying to contract things concentrically, the faster we move, the less force we're kind of capable of generating. When you're contracting concentrically, we typically see the highest force production when we're moving more slowly. And if you think about how you move when you're trying to do a max lift, you're not going very fast. That load is challenging enough that it's all you can do to make it move just an inch at a time. That is when we're capable of generating the most force with concentric contractions. But again, eccentric's a little different. But I always think of it as kind of more like the fact that we can produce more force eccentrically at high velocity is kind of the hanging on for dear life aspect. If we are all of a sudden if I'm standing up and somebody throws a 200-pound weight into my arms, I don't want to drop it on my feet, so I want to try and slow it down as much as I can, but it's way too much weight for me to think about curling. So it is going to pull me down rapidly, but I'm going to fight really hard to try and prevent gravity from winning that battle if I want to protect my toes. But it's kind of strange, but that's the way that they've graphed it out and kind of shown what our force capabilities are with those different muscle contraction types.
Hey, Craig, can you repeat about eccentric? Because like in my mind, I'm just trying to shift and figure out, because like in exercise, I've always been taught to like go slow when you're doing eccentric.
Yeah, and
so
when you're doing a weight, let's say I'm doing my squats and I've got whatever, my warm up about 350, 400 pounds. When I'm going down, I'm working eccentrically. When we're doing lifts with weights, we're almost never limited in this ability. It's the ability to come back up. That is what we have to use the weight for. So if my max is a given weight, it's my max ability to move that weight against gravity. So the concentric part. So when we tell people like go slow on the way down, we're trying to maximize that eccentric phase. But as we lower that weight, we'd be capable of generating a lot more force going down and controlling it than we would be lifting that same weight up against gravity. So because we're capped out with standard lifts like a bench or squat or whatever with what we can move on the way up against gravity, it's well within our potential to go slowly on the way down. And it does challenge us more eccentrically for that given load. But if you think about, like, if you've done a set of exercises to fatigue, let's say I'm doing my bench press and I get to my last rep and I'm right here, that person spotting me can help me finish the lift on the way up. And then I can still control it on the way down. But then when I go to push it back up, I can't get it unless that person keeps helping me. And so you can have that, your spotter help you crank out a few more concentric reps, but you're fully in control of it typically on the way down eccentrically until you really fatigue. So that's just kind of an example of how we are capable of generating a lot more force eccentrically than concentrically. But unless we can add that extra load right before the eccentric phase, then we can't really maximally train the eccentric phase of the lift. So if every time I did my squat rep or my bench rep, I had my spotters take weight off for my concentric and then slap an extra 45 on each side for my eccentric, then I could challenge those eccentrics a little bit more, but it becomes riskier because then it's harder and harder to control it on the way down. If I keep slapping on extra weight just for the eccentric phase, at some point I'm not going to be able to control it and I might get, crushed by that weight. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. Did you say that, I might have heard this wrong. Did you say that you can produce more force quicker on the eccentric?
What the studies have shown is that when our muscles are best capable of producing the peak force values is when we're contracting eccentrically at high speeds. Essentially, I've been given such a big challenge that, like, say, if I'm all of a sudden somebody hands me a huge amount of weight and I don't want to just drop it right on my feet, I'm going to try as hard as I can to control it. But if they were measuring my force producing capability, that's when I would produce the most, is essentially moving quickly on the way down. And that's why I call it kind of the hanging on for dear life. You're trying to do what you can, but the load is too great for you to truly control it, but you're still fighting really hard to try and maintain control over it. And most of those studies were done using isokinetic testing devices, which are a really safe kind of controlled environment where you have electronically resistance forces that can be shut off instantaneously. So you're not really at risk of somebody getting crushed under 500 pounds of steel weights or anything like that. All right, any other eccentric, concentric, speed type questions? All right, let's look at fatigue. Lots of different causes of fatigue. It really depends on what the activity that induced the fatigue was doing to your body, as far as which of these forms of fatigue would tend to predominate. Certainly we can lose the ability to recruit motor units, and if we can't recruit all of our motor units because they're, 10% of them are too tired out, then we're going to lose that force producing capability. In order to maximally generate force, we need to call into play all the motor units in a given muscle to kind of help with that task. Decrease in energy stores, that's most common with, you can burn through a lot of ATP when you're doing resistance training. And usually what that does is some of the things down at the bottom causes more problems with your pH than anything. When we look at truly reducing the energy stores available in the body, it's more common to see that with really prolonged endurance activities, where we are depleting all the muscle glycogen, where we are depleting and not giving the body enough time to use oxygen to generate ATP aerobically. And certainly that happens with resistance training. With most forms of resistance training, because we take lots of rest breaks, it gives our body a chance to kind of recover from that set of fatigue that fatigue that we felt during that one set of exercises, and then we can redo that challenge again. because we haven't really depleted all of our energy stores yet. So that's definitely more common with endurance activity than when you're going for hours on end. Insufficient oxygen certainly causes lots of problems with resistance training, and most forms of resistance training, if we are really doing an overload to try and help somebody improve their strength, we're going to be using anaerobic ATP generating processes. And so we produce a lot of metabolic waste, and if we don't have that oxygen present, then that metabolic waste can build up a lot faster. And that's where we need that 2 minutes of recovery in between our set of weights to kind of clear some of that metabolic waste out of the way, so that now we can go back to generating ATP using anaerobic processes again. Because again, most resistance training, we're going to be much more anaerobic than aerobic when it comes to where we're generating our ATP. Calcium, why is calcium important? Where's calcium come into play with muscle contraction and fatigue?
Isn't that, it promotes the conduction of the signal, doesn't it? To the motor units?
It does, yep. So when we look at an axon and the all or none action potential traveling down the axon, when it gets to that neuromuscular end plate, that calcium has to come in to cause the neurotransmitters to move across that synaptic cleft and make contact with the muscle itself to initiate contraction. So calcium is definitely involved on the nervous side of things. It also plays a big role in the muscle itself. What's that role?
Isn't it released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum?
I heard part of it. Samantha?
Isn't it? I don't know if I have to, but isn't it released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum?
Yep. So from that yep. So with every time we generate that depolarization on the muscle itself, then that wave of depolarization travels along the skin essentially of the muscle, hits those transverse tubules where it can then dive deep into the muscle and depolarize internally, and that triggers that release of the stored calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. That calcium is needed to bind to the troponin so that we can move the tropomyosin filament out of the way and let the actin and myosin interact with one another. So in order for actin and myosin to bond, we need that calcium to trigger those other related components. And so if we've been making the muscle fire and fire and fire and fire, we've been draining that sarcoplasmic reticulum of calcium, and maybe we're not giving it enough time to pump the calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum where it can be released again. So that's kind of one of the key areas, but certainly it could happen at the end of the nerve too, like Tom mentioned, that might be a limiting factor too. And we do see that reduced excitability at the neuromuscular junction, and that could potentially be calcium related, but it can certainly also be the neurotransmitter itself. Either we can't reform it quickly enough to send it back over to the muscle, or we can't release it from the muscle fast enough to send it back over. So we can kind of have problems with the acetylcholine being available to be released from the end of the nerve, but we also have problems with not enough acetylcholinesterase potentially chopping that acetylcholine out of the muscle's receptor sites so it can go back to the end of the nerve and be reused. Because the calcium and acetylcholine are both compounds that we're going to recycle. We're going to use, make it do its thing, pump it back to where it was, send it back out again. So we definitely try to be pretty efficient with how we use those things.
For those that have a calcium deficiency, is that more apt for them to have a muscle tear or anything like that? Or is it just you're not able to do anything with a lot of weight? It's going to be more reps and ISO.
It'd be more fatigue related. If they have a true calcium deficiency, they're just going to have a hard time generating a lot of force with muscle contraction, or potentially having the ability to do a lot of repetitions with muscle contraction. I don't think that it would necessarily cause weakness in the muscle itself. You might have issues with bone mineral density potentially, but I wouldn't think that it would have a lot to do with making the muscle more fragile in any way. All right. Fiber type fatigue. Our type 1s are the least resistant to fatigue, so they have the best endurance. Our type 2Bs/2Xs are the most easily fatigued. They're gonna run out of gas the fastest, and that has to do with a lot of different factors, but mostly it's related to um, the type of ATP cleaving enzyme that it has available. Is one of the primary factors, and then a lot of other things related to blood flow and enzymes and mitochondrial density and capillary density and things like that can play a big role too. The things that are listed down here with cardiopulmonary fatigue are usually not going to be a factor with most types of resistance training. Now you might see decreased glycogen stores, especially if people are not consuming carbohydrates in adequate amounts and they're trying to train hard. Doing resistance training is an anaerobic activity, and if we're not taking in carbohydrates, then we're not going to have a lot of available glycogen to break down. And so we can definitely run through what we have in storage pretty quickly if we're doing doing like a keto diet and we're not taking in very many carbohydrates. It's going to be hard to do a lot of resistance training because it is a high intensity activity and we're not really having the ability to use a lot of oxygen to take the longer pathways to burn the fat stores that we have available to us. But if you're eating good amounts of carbohydrates, usually a typical resistance training exercise isn't going to cause a lot of glycogen depletion. You might see it in select muscle groups, like if you have like some of these, people that live in the weight room that do like 10 sets of bench and stuff like that. Well, if you're doing 10 sets of bench in a row, then yeah, you might deplete the glycogen in there. But I think it's kind of stupid to do 10 sets of bench. I think you'd be get a lot more bang for your buck by doing a bigger variety of chest exercises than just doing all bunch of the same thing. All right, so signs and symptoms of fatigue. These are things that we really need to keep an eye out for when we're working with our patients. Most of our patients are patients because they don't have full strength. They have limitations in some way or another. And I can't stress enough how important it is when we're trying to help people regain movement, function, strength. Quality is way more important than quantity. We need to make sure that our patients are properly stabilizing their body parts so they don't injure something. Make sure that they're completing repetitions through the full arc of motion that we're after, making sure that they have good control of the motion throughout the repetitions that we're doing. And when we start seeing signs that the patient is starting to lose control, as that list shows right there, that's when we need to make them stop. When we're looking at somebody that's healthy and is just trying to get in better shape, then sometimes you might do an extra rep or two when you're starting to see some of these things just because you're trying to increase the challenge to the muscle and create a potentially bigger overload. But in most cases, these are all signs that you're losing control, that you're losing quality. And so especially with a lot of our patients, you're going to see the muscles shaking, that's tremulous. So we start trying to complete that lift and you start seeing the person kind of wobbling and shaking like that. If you've ever helped somebody lift and been a spotter, you know that when you start seeing that, you're like, okay, this person's about out of gas. I really got to be on my toes because they very well might not complete this next rep and I might need to take the weight from them. Same thing, unintentionally slowing down the reps. When you see that they're having a hard time completing that rep quickly, then you know that those muscles are starting to get tired too. The jerky movements, that's often a sign that you're kind of, as you change the joint angle, that all of a sudden you're like trying to throw in some other muscle groups or some other motor units within that muscle group to kind of help you complete that motion. But it's usually not a sign that you are, feeling fresh. It's that you're starting to run out of gas and you're doing whatever you can to kind of help complete the lift. When we start not being able to complete that full rep, then that's a sign of fatigue. And even if you're just doing active range of motion and the person's body weight, the weight of their limb is what the challenge is. If they can't fully bring that hand up to their shoulder and you're doing curls, I'm going right there and I'm running out of gas. Well, that's also a sign of fatigue. Even though the challenge isn't much, it's just the weight of my forearm and hand, that might be all they have when we look at nerve injuries or nervous system impairments in particular. We definitely don't want to see substitutions. We're trying to very specifically target certain movements, certain muscle groups when we're doing rehab with patients. And so when we start seeing people cheating by substituting, arching their back, trying to use momentum to complete lifts, things like that, again, those are just all signs of poor quality movement. And usually the goal is to finish those 10 reps in the set or whatever. So we don't want to stress quantity over quality. Definitely not an AMRAP thought process with PT. If you're familiar with that, as many reps as possible. Definitely a recipe for substitutions and potentially injury, especially when we're dealing with people that have fragile tissues. That should never be a goal. In any of the, maybe at the very higher levels of rehab, if you're probably out of what's reimbursable, if you're working for an athletic department or something like that, then you might be pushing people to that point because they're trying to get back on the field of play and their injuries are recovered enough to handle that stuff. But most of what we do in the medically reimbursed aspect of PT, we're never going to get to that point. We want to maintain control, good form, protect, rather than try to do too much and get somebody hurt. All right, what time we got? 42. Let's slide it down. Not very far. I'm going to skip that video because I'm not very far. It's a pretty funny video. I think it's up on Canvas. It's two women that are fighting to the finish line after doing a Ironman triathlon, which is a hugely long event, and they're basically stumbling all over each other and falling down. And there's another one that, it's not this one, but there's one where this woman actually loses bowel control while she's trying to crawl across the finish line. So I try not to push myself to that point. I like to keep bowels continent.
That's Julie Moss. That's famous in triathlete circles.
Yeah. This one it's Laura Ingraham and somebody else. I can't remember the other person, but they're like just, the one woman is like starting to walk with this horrible gait, and then she like falls down to the ground, and this other woman comes past her, and then she collapses, and they're both end up crawling across the finish line, literally. So feel free to watch it on your own time.
I saw that happen at my niece's cross country state meet. Sophomore led the race, and she basically just started out way too fast and died along the 100-meter last stretch, crawling, falling. It was crazy.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing to see it in an Ironman where you're out there for 8, 10, 12, 14 hours, but it's another thing when it's a 20-minute cross country race. If you push hard enough, then that can still happen for sure. All right, so we talked about the SAID principle, specific adaptations to impose demands, and these are basically the adaptations that we see going on in the body. So I mentioned how motor unit recruitment and synchronization of motor units is really the key thing that helps us get stronger initially before we actually start gaining muscle mass, and that is what we see as this first listing here. Once we have a person start doing a challenging activity, really quickly, the sensory system is going to help coordinate with the motor system to try and help you how to figure out how to handle that load. Recognize the forces that are being put on your body through the sensory system and figure out how many motor units do I need to recruit, when in that given movement do I need to recruit them to make that lift or that exercise be smooth and controlled in a good way. And so that does come really quickly. Hypertrophy of skeletal muscle is going to take longer. Usually it's going to take at least a month before we see any sort of significant thickening up of the actin myosin that's going to be measurable. We are basically damaging skeletal muscle tissue when we do resistance training, and the adaptation that causes growth is repairing that, and the body going, hey, you know what, that was too heavy, I better get stronger, so the next time I'm faced with this challenge, I can handle it better. And it's not an overnight thing. It takes weeks and months to really gain significant amounts of hypertrophy. But that is just, most of it is thought to be the actin myosin filaments themselves getting thicker. Um, Hyperplasia is the idea that we're going to actually cause cell division and make more muscle fibers. Have one muscle fiber that splits and becomes two muscle fibers, and then that would make the muscle get thicker too. There's pretty limited research to support that we do that to much extent, if at all. And kind of same lines, fiber type remodeling. Again, pretty minimal hard evidence that we really do that to a large amount. There might be a small percentage that we do shift over time, but it's pretty minimal. The vascular changes, I put this asterisk before this first one because I don't really agree with the way that it's phrased. I went ahead and left it in there. It's probably straight out of your book. It says decreased capillary and mitochondrial density, and then in parentheses, only in resistance training. You have decreased capillary and mitochondrial density with resistance training compared to endurance training. But if you take somebody that's untrained and you start them just doing resistance training, where they weren't challenging their muscles at all, now they are, you're still going to grow more capillaries into that area because you're producing a lot of waste, and your body wants to be able to get rid of that waste quickly. So even if it's an anaerobic activity where we're thinking, oh, we need more capillaries so we can deliver more blood, well, if it's an anaerobic, glycogen burning activity, glucose burning activity, we need to get rid of all the hydrogen ions and the lactate that the body's producing, and so that will create a stimulus to grow more capillaries in there so that we can get rid of some of that waste more quickly. So I don't really agree that you will decrease it. Like say, if the person is untrained and they haven't been doing anything, those factors are both going to increase because you're challenging the muscle above and beyond what it used to be doing. Now you won't see the same increase that we would see with endurance activity because that is more prolonged and have a longer stimulus that says, hey, we need a lot of blood to this muscle because this muscle keeps having to contract and contract and contract for 30 minutes for an hour continuously. So that is a bigger driver for increasing those components that deliver oxygen and help the mitochondria use oxygen to generate lots of ATP aerobically. But I don't agree that we won't see changes with resistance training, especially if the person is untrained. Connective tissue strengthening is huge from our perspective. We see a lot of patients with muscle strains, with ligament tears, with issues with the joint capsule, with joint replacements, coming off of fractures, all these things that have caused them to be more immobile in that body part, and they've lost the ability to tolerate resistance and tolerate a stimulus. And so we're the ones that are introducing their body back to bigger forces. And we do have to give them some time to recover, but that's certainly one of the key goals that we're trying to accomplish with a lot of our resistance training. Certainly we want the person to have good control so that they can be safe and coordinated doing their movements and their functional activities, but we need to toughen up those tissues so they're not going to tear when they are faced with bigger challenges. And so we do have to be cautious with how quickly we introduce resistance training so that we don't overload the tissue too soon. But this is definitely one of the key adaptations that we're usually trying to help patients get back so that they will be able to recover from their injury, whatever the case might be. Body composition training. Certainly if you add in resistance work to somebody that's never done it before, they're going to gain some muscle mass, but it takes a while. Again, up here, if we look at skeletal muscle hypertrophy after 4 to 8 weeks. So 1 to 2 months is kind of when we first start seeing it. And so it is going to take a good bit of time to truly gain a lot of mass. Most of our patients, there certainly are patients that we see for more than 2 months, but there are a lot of patients that we don't see for more than 2 months. We get the referral, we work with them for weeks to maybe 2 months, and then we discharge them, and then they're on their own. So we don't have as much opportunity as, say, a personal trainer does to really see the effects of these chronic adaptations like gaining muscle mass. That's not something that happens overnight like the neuromuscular control part does. All right, so we have some reasons why we would not want to do resistance exercise, and pain would certainly be a big one. Any kind of acute condition where things are really inflamed, those tissues aren't happy right now. Why do we want to put a bigger load on them and make them more unhappy? They're in a vulnerable state at this point. And then when people have had significant cardiovascular problems, I would put vascular more so than cardiopulmonary. We want to avoid overloading the circulatory system as much as anything. When we do lifts, we cause big increases in blood pressure. We were typically having to like stabilize our core, and that's going to compress on the inferior vena cava, potentially elevate systemic blood pressure. If we're gripping things and doing isometric contractions to hold on to weights, those are all isometric contractions that kind of make it hard for blood to flow into the muscle groups that are actively contracting. And so it can shoot your blood pressure up really, really high. And when people have had delicate surgical repairs or they have delicate heart tissue, that's not really what we want to do. We don't want to put those forces on the body until they've healed up enough to be able to tolerate them internally. So that's a big part of why we hold off on doing a lot of resistance work with those early stage cardiac patients in particular. Precautions, we'll go through a couple more things and then we'll take our break here. So a Valsalva maneuver, everybody familiar with that? Basically holding your breath while you're pushing out and exerting. It's what we do to have a bowel movement, but it's also what a lot of people do when they're lifting. They have a tendency to hold their breath, and it does a couple things. It stabilizes your body because internally we've got this, air chamber that we're not changing the shape of, and so that internal air pressure does create some stability, but it also is compressing on that inferior vena cava and limiting venous return. So that's kind of the big reason why we don't do the Valsalva, or we try to not encourage people to do the Valsalva. It does raise your blood pressure very significantly too, and can cause problems with blood vessels potentially tearing or capillaries tearing and things like that. We want to watch out for substitutions. Again, if the goal is to work a certain muscle in a certain position, when we start seeing the patient modify their position or modify how they're recruiting muscles and which muscles are being used, then they're not getting out of the activity what we want them to get out of the activity. So we want to, again, go for quality over quantity. When we start seeing substitutions, it's time to rest. Or trying to correct the motion. If they can't correct the motion without substituting, then it's time to rest. Do something else, or give them a minute or two and then come back to that same activity if you still feel like it needs a little bit more work there. Anybody that's done resistance training has probably experienced exercise-induced muscle soreness. And we've got basically two types. We've got the kind that you feel while you're doing the activity, that feel the burn kind of pain, but then we have the delayed. And that's really a bigger sign that we've got muscle tissue damage. That feel the burn pain is usually more pH related changes because you've got a lot of waste in the muscle that's doing the work. And once we quit doing the work, we're going to flush all that out and the muscle is going to be just fine. We won't have suffered really any permanent harm from it. Delayed onset muscle soreness, or DOMS, is the feeling that we get a day, 2 days, 3 days after doing a challenging resistance exercise, where it hurts to move. Everything is sore. That's a sign that we've got some tissue damage going on, that we've got potentially some local edema going on. And we kind of, it's listed with the precautions because a little bit is okay, and we're probably fine to do another workout if we just still have a little bit of lingering soreness. But if we have significant pain, soreness, we're still tender to the touch, then take another day. There's no need to really put the muscle through that extra tissue damage when it hasn't even recovered from the last bout of activity. Um, if you give your body a chance to recover, then it's going to be able to better tolerate the activity the next time. So it can be sometimes people, if they are having a lot of soreness from their workout because they increased the weight or added in extra sets of something new, then we want to back off a little bit, maybe still do some of those motions, but with a much lighter weight. But it's not necessarily the time to keep pushing things. The overload principle doesn't mean that every workout needs to be harder than the last one. You have to take into the fact that we do need to adapt and accommodate. The overload principle is over time, we need to progressively increase things, but that doesn't mean every single workout needs to be harder than the last one. That's not sustainable for very long. Risk of pathological fracture. So that's going to be mostly with our cancer patients, certainly also with somebody that has osteoporosis, or something really, more random, rare disease like osteogenesis imperfecta. We're not really going to do much in the way of resistance training with those kids. They snap pretty quickly. But osteoporosis, definitely something to think about. What type of activities we're going to have a patient do that has really bad spinal osteoporosis to help make sure they don't suffer compression fractures by giving them too much weight. All right, there's our 5-drum components. The Who was probably my favorite band in high school, so I didn't put this slide together, and I saw that. I was like, oh, The Who, cool. I saw them in concert my senior year in high school. We had a senior skip day, so I skipped school. I was a hoodlum. It was a Friday, I believe, and we all got in trouble. So it was worth it because I could tell you guys the story and laugh about it. So,
How do you get in trouble for a senior skip day?
well, because it wasn't really authorized. The school district couldn't say that it was okay, even though it was a tradition.
Oh,
It's never authorized.
It's never authorized. Yeah. So I didn't get in bad trouble, but I was on the bad list, the naughty list. I don't remember what I got for Christmas that year. So probably not much, probably some coal. All right, so when it comes to resistance training, we can vary really all of these things, these 5-drum components. How many times a day, how many times a week are we doing it? Our intensity is typically thought of as the resistance that we're using. Is it body weight? Is it 200 pounds on that squat rack? Is it 5-pound dumbbell? Is it the red TheraBand versus the yellow TheraBand? Those would all be intensity factors. Our volume is really our sets and our reps. So both of those are considered volume components. Velocity going to be our speed of movement. Duration can be a lot of different things. Can be how long are you going to do this resistance program? How long is your actual workout going to be? How long are you going to do a specific exercise? And so the duration can be, when we look at within a workout, it's definitely very closely tied to that volume. Because the more volume you have, the longer it takes to accomplish that motion or that activity. Rest periods are big. We need at least about 2 minutes of rest between exercises to recover and be able to handle that activity again with good form and good technique and all those things. So we do need to give our patients enough rest in between activities, or you can switch and alternate between activities. So do an upper body thing and then do a lower body thing, then do an upper body thing, then do a lower body thing. You don't have to have as much just inactive downtime compared to if I said, let's do an upper body exercise, now let's do another upper body exercise, now let's do an upper body exercise. You got to give that person a lot more recovery if you keep hitting the same muscle all the time. But if we alternate, then that lets us kind of minimize the downtime to make that session more efficient. And then our mode, lots of different types. We'll talk about those different mode things that we can do with resistance training. All right, it's about 9. So let's take our little 10 minutes. If you need a bathroom break or walk around break, or stretch break, or you want to go get in a couple sets, got about 10 minutes to get in your sets.
So speaking of all this, something funny slash not so funny. So at my age, our age, I've always thought about CrossFit as a little dangerous
Mhm.
to just do out of nowhere. Well, I learned over the weekend that yoga is also hazardous to my health
Yeah.
because I pushed myself a little too hard and I have a complete muscle spasm in my left lower back.
Were you doing more like flow or more static postures or?
Well, it was both, but I pushed it too hard in like a reverse warrior pose, taking my left leg into extension and just trying to lift it too far.
Yeah.
And I was fine until yesterday when I went to do a stretch and it just locked up.
No fun.
No, so I'm old.
Well,
Allie, at this point, you just need to live in a bubble.
or just be more moderate, maybe.
I don't know how to be moderate and I like to push myself, but at this age it's a little bit more time to recover, I guess.
Mhm. Yeah, I did. My wife and I ran along Bonneville Shoreline Trail from Rock Canyon down to Slate Canyon and back. And then she took the dog, and then I went ahead and did Squaw Peak up and back yesterday after that. And I can definitely tell I've been running mostly around my neighborhood, which is really flat, with the trails being kind of mucky and just the daylight being shorter. It's hard to do pre and post work and stuff. And so I could definitely have more soreness today from doing the hills. And the trail was great. I mean, it was smooth and hard packed snow. I had my micro spikes on, but I was able to bomb down that downhill. I think in some ways it was faster. I've done that hike in the when things are wet, and that trail can be really muddy, and there's sections of it where it's really like a narrow foot placement thing. But with the snow on there, it just filled it in and made it pretty flat. So it was actually almost easier in some ways to do it in the winter.
Awesome.
The footing was more consistent, which is surprising.
Well, I'm glad you just have a little DOMS and not complete muscle spasm.
Yes. Me too.
So I saw your message about the CPR
Uh-huh.
and I was a little confused. So we got to sign up for that class. But then it said there was something on campus, skills
So
pass offs, or there was an online component. I just kind of got lost. So what is it I need to do?
everybody needs to be CPR certified before you start your clinicals, which will be whatever early July, I think, probably for you guys. Our usually the school hosts that company that I posted the link for their site. They would offer classes at least once a month on campus in the evenings, and usually it would be the full class. And I think with the pandemic, they've kind of cut back on some of the in-person stuff. So they have an option where you can do all the understanding the procedures and taking the test over all the different parameters for CPR, order that you would do things in, and what you do for kids versus adults, and all that kind of stuff. You can take that written test online, but then in order to get certified, you still have to come in and show the instructor that you're doing your depth, your compressions to the right depth, and that your speed is the correct speed. So that's the skills test part. So I think you can still do it on campus. I only saw one offering on campus for the skills test coming up. So if you've never had CPR before, I think it's valuable to do it in person. If you've done CPR before, especially if you've done it lots of times, then you can often just take the written test and then go demo your skills. If you, like say, if you've never done it before, then I would say you might want to look at some of the other places that they offer those classes where they are having the full class, so that you can get more hands-on instruction with the specific techniques and things like that. So if you go under other on their website at the top, then that's where you can find the stuff that's offered at Provo, which is, like I said, I think I only saw one listing and it was just for the skills test part. But if you go under BLS, then you can pick all kinds of different ones. They offer some at UVU, they offer some up in Salt Lake Valley. They offer them kind of throughout the whole Wasatch Front, I think, at different locations and dates. So you can find something that works good for your schedule, that's not too far from home or work, that would fit maybe better than what we have available on campus.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Hey, Craig, I really need you to get certified in needling so you can fix me when I break myself.
Yeah, Jake, who used to be with us, did a lot of needling. I'm not sure if Doug did needling or not.
I think he said he does do it at his clinic,
Yeah.
but yeah, in fact the clinic I go to in Orem does it, and they fixed my piriformis like that.
Uh-huh.
So I know that's what I need right now, and I kind of wish PTAs could get certified in it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I had it done once before I had my surgery on my foot, but and I had some, distinct bands of muscle that were tight in my calf that he needled, and I actually had E-stem hooked up through the needle, which is an interesting feeling to have that internal electrode instead of just
It is. It's pretty
electrode.
neat.
but my foot was too far gone to do
Yeah.
much with that at that point. So
I actually saw a PT perform needling, and every time they went to the calf, it was almost like you were just murdering them. Like the calf was one of the worst places to ever have a muscle cramp.
yeah, I didn't have that much pain with the needling. I mean, it was not bad, but I could see where if you were having a lot of pain with it, then yes. I was mostly having just pain with my Achilles attached to my bone, so it didn't really, my muscle wasn't that bad off.
It was really
Uh,
interesting too to see how the needling, as soon as you hit that certain nerve and the muscle spasms would contract.
mhm.
It was interesting how sometimes as it would contract, it actually bent the needle. Sometimes as you were pulling out, you could see it bend from where it was constantly contracting on the needle.
Mhm.
So it was interesting to see.
Yeah, they're pretty skinny needles, so I could see where you might. All right, let's jump back into this because I want to get through at least some of the things that we'll be talking about in lab today, so you'll have some idea what the goal is of some of these different exercise types. So these next things are pretty general, and these are just things to think about both for yourself as well as patients that you might be working with. We want to make sure that we really have a good understanding of the muscle itself and how it's shaped, where its lines of orientation are for the muscle fibers themselves, so that we're making the body work at the proper angle to be safe and challenging for that muscle. We need to think about how challenging we want to make the activity by considering gravity. And so if you remember from Kines with our MMT testing, if we needed to make it gravity minimal, then we need to think about the position that we're putting that person in. And so kind of same thing with resistance training. If we might want somebody to do a certain motion, but we might not want a lot of challenge, or maybe we do want to make it more challenging. And the more directly you're lifting against gravity, the more challenging it's going to be concentrically on the way up, and the more challenging it's going to be eccentrically on the way down if it's directly against gravity. Um, our stabilization, again, we want to help minimize substitution so that when we're doing a given action, a given motion with a lift, that we're actually using the proper muscle that we're trying to improve. We need to think about external versus internal stabilization. And so external can be, somebody being on a bench and the bench pinning their scapula against their body can stabilize that scapula. It can be, us stabilizing the scapula or stabilizing the hip so that the person can move the limb without worrying about those more proximal joints moving and causing some instability. And then mostly what we want to try and teach people is how to internally stabilize. How do they actively engage the muscles that they need to use to stabilize themselves? That should be the ultimate goal in most cases, because we want to really protect the whole body. Then we need to be able to generate those proper stabilization techniques internally. As far as exercise order, generally you're going to try and work your bigger muscles first and then move into your smaller muscles. Most of the lifts that use your big muscles tend to be multi-joint motions. You think about doing a bench press, a squat, a deadlift, a pull-up. None of those are just one muscle. It's not like a bicep curl or a tricep extension where we're just doing one distinct action. We got three-dimensional type control that we're having to do to stabilize things while we're moving our body through those big arcs of motion to do a squat or a deadlift. And so this is important. Both of these things are important really because we want to make sure that we're safe with those bigger motions. And if we do a lot of small muscle group exercise first, or we do a lot of, say, bicep and tricep movements before we start trying to do pull-ups and push-ups, then those smaller muscles will fatigue before we actually challenge the bigger muscles. And so typically that's kind of the rationale why we typically will want to do bigger, complex, compound, multi-joint motions first, and then move into and finish up with the more isolated exercises. High intensity before low intensity. Again, high intensity is going to be harder to control, more dangerous. And if we've already kind of fatigue things by doing a lot of lower intensity activity or doing a lot of single joint muscles, and then we ask the person to do a high intensity thing, then they're maybe not able to stabilize as well or not able to perform at as high of intensity. And if our goal is high intensity because we want that conditioning effect, then we want the person to be more fresh when they're going into that activity. So these are probably a little less relevant for a lot of PT related things that we do because those are patients, and we usually are working on more isolated body parts. But certainly when we look at just a general fitness routine, then these are really good things to think about for your own self or any family member, friend that you might be helping with their program. All right, I'm going to skip through most of this 5-drum stuff because we've kind of already talked about it. I did want to touch on this intensity part. When we look at challenging somebody, there's many times where sub-maximal strength work is going to be the best choice. Anytime somebody's injury is very fresh, we're going to start out with kind of gentle isometrics and then work into stronger isometrics and then start moving into our concentric and our eccentric exercises. Sub-max, while it's not going to create as much of an overload as pushing somebody to max, it is inherently a lot safer. And when we're trying to teach people proper form and help encourage synchronization of muscle recruitment and coordination of movements, it's a lot easier to do that when we're not pushing the ability of that muscle by giving them a really, really heavy load. So there's definitely a lot of reasons why we go sub-max, and we work on control and form, and then and let the tissues adapt to that lighter challenge. And then as they get in better shape and have better form and are better able to recruit the muscles we're after, then we can start pushing the boundaries a little bit more and making it more challenging. And that's when we'll get more of the overload effect as far as actually helping improve neuromuscular firing to generate max force, helping to improve motor recruitment to be able to accomplish those max lifts, and then over time the hypertrophy as well. All right, with volume, they've done a number of studies, and typically the most common workout routine that you hear about and that has been used over and over and over is kind of the 3 sets of 10 idea for general conditioning. And that's kind of right in the middle of this 1 to 6 sets, 2 to 4 being pretty routine, and that's pretty normal for general conditioning. There's a lot of research that really says you can get by with just doing 1 set as long as you do that 1 set to true fatigue, that you'll still get the vast majority of benefits that you would get from 3 sets of 10 if you do 1 set of 10 where that 10th rep is really, really challenging for you to complete. And when you're short on time, rather than skipping the workout entirely, go with 1 set of everything. And you'll still, you won't necessarily progress, but you'll do a good job of kind of maintaining and not backsliding and losing ground. Velocity, usually when we first start working with people, we're moving at pretty slow velocities because we're more interested in control and quality and not substituting and that kind of stuff. But certainly when we're dealing with an athletic population, then we definitely need to include some things at higher velocity because their sport is going to be, using high velocity, and we need to make sure they can tolerate those forces also. All right. As far as our rest is concerned, between sets of a given exercise, we want to look at 2 to 3 minutes of rest if we really want them to be optimally able to challenge themselves fully on the next set from a max strength benefit. If we're looking at trying to improve muscle endurance, then shortening that rest time, only giving them a minute, do a set of 20, rest a minute, do another set of 20, rest a minute. That's going to do a lot for muscle endurance because we haven't recovered as completely, but that's also usually going to be a much lower load. But if you're really pushing a heavier load and you're pushing to fatigue at the end of each set, then we really need like 2 to 3 minutes of rest. And that can be, maybe you don't want to have the person just sit there for 3 minutes, have them do something else in that time period, whether it's a stretch, whether it's a different muscle group, then that's a good way to make better use of your time. Typically, we look at 48 hours between sessions, and that's definitely true when we're trying to really make big overload principle type of strength gains. With a lot of our therapy settings, especially the inpatient ones, you're working with patients every day, and you might be doing some of the similar exercises every day. There's not a problem with having somebody do quad sets every day when they're recovering from knee surgery. They're not going to necessarily have a lot of delayed onset muscle soreness from doing quad sets. So you kind of have to take this 48 hours kind of with a grain of salt. How challenging, how much tissue damage did we create from our previous workout? And certainly if you're looking at a healthy population that's just trying to do a general strength and conditioning workout, then 48-hour recovery between muscle groups is important. And some people want to lift weights every day. Usually people that do that are going to develop a split routine where they're doing either upper body Monday, Wednesday, Friday, lower body Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, or they're doing all the pushing exercises Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and all the pulling exercises Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, or something like that. All right, so our mode, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about mode and specifically apply that to resistance. So I think that's what's coming up next. We'll look at progression and then we'll go into those modes. So progression principles, how are we going to make things harder? How are we going to follow that overload principle? And these are kind of the different things that we can vary to increase the challenge as the person gets in better and better shape and their muscle becomes more tolerant of what we're asking it to do. So go from twice a week to 3 times a week would be an increase in frequency. Once a day to twice a day would be an increase in frequency. Or intensity. Most of these things are going from smaller amounts to bigger amounts, slower speeds to faster speeds is kind of the general progression. And a lot of these are just kind of common sense that we might just move through a small arc of the motion, and then as the person improves, then we can work into that more full arc of motion. About the only one that goes the opposite order is this rest period. As somebody gets in better shape, then we don't give them as much time to rest, and that will help them improve mostly their muscle endurance when we look at that. All right, general, we do want to let the person warm up a little bit, and that can be some, low-level cardiovascular type activity. If you're doing a full body workout, then you want to pick something that's going to use both the upper body and the lower body. So rowing machine and elliptical, things like that are going to be a more effective full body warm up than walking on a treadmill or riding a bike would be, because you're using both upper and lower body. It can also involve things like more about your dynamic warm up activities, arm swings, leg swings, things like that. And usually a really good one for resistance training is to just do the motion that you're getting ready to have them do, but with a much lighter load. Do a set of bench press with just the bar before you actually start putting weights on. So you kind of take the body parts through the range of motion that you're going to have them do before you throw on the bigger resistance to give them a challenge. Make sure they're stabilized, whether it's a external support or that they're engaging their own muscles to stabilize things. With our patients in particular, everything should be pain-free. If they're hurting when we do it, then we need to make it lighter or think of a different angle or change something about it so the pain is not there. This third to last bullet point is important. We don't want to increase too many things at once. If we're going to try and judge on their next visit and assess how their previous visit was, the more variables we change, the harder it is to figure out what made them so sore. Is it because we added more weight, or is it because we added more sets? So we typically want to increase one or the other, either make it harder as far as the resistance they're pushing is concerned, or the speed of the movement would be another way to increase the intensity. But we don't want to do more weight and do more sets at the same time, because then we don't know, are they sore because we did more sets? Are they sore because we did more weight? Demonstration is super critical. There's lots of patients that can't visualize what you're telling them until they see it. They can't read a piece of paper or look at one still picture of a exercise and figure out what they're supposed to do. But if they see it in action, and you demonstrate the really critical form things to think about with that motion, then they're going to have a lot more success in replicating the movement the way that we want them to do that movement. So demonstration is key. And as you're doing lab this week, really incorporate that. As you're teaching your partner how to do a given movement, you need to try it out. And we have some equipment in the gym that some of you may not be familiar with. So if you're not familiar with it, now is the time to try and figure it out, play around with it, see what it feels like, see how you need to position your body to accomplish these things, see how to get on and off of that total gym safely. Things like that can be important. You don't want to be unfamiliar with a piece of equipment and then trying to instruct your patient on how to use it. We need to be really familiar with it ourselves, what it feels like, what we need to watch out for so that we can do a better job of conveying that to our patients.
Hey, Craig, I have a question about the stretching.
Yep.
Is it better to be isometric or dynamic for the warm up and the cool down?
I think isometric is, or static would be the better term, I guess, is more important after the fact. I tend to not be a big advocate of doing static stretching before activity, mostly because there's enough research that shows that kind of, they think, resets the sensitivity of the muscle spindle and changes kind of the calibration of what a lot of force is going through that muscle. And so it can decrease our force producing capabilities, is what the research shows if we do a lot of static stretches before we challenge the body. So I'm more of a fan of doing dynamic warm-up activities beforehand and then do your static stretching afterwards when we've been asking that muscle to do all these repeated contractions. We're done. Now's the time to kind of lengthen things back out and try and remove some of the tightness that you might feel after lifting. So I'm more of a dynamic before and a static post when I actually do warm up or cool down appropriately, personally. So. All right, so hopefully we'll get through this information today, and that'll probably be a good place to stop. We got about 30 minutes left. So we've got all these different categories, and we're just going to kind of work through them one by one so you get an understanding of what that means, because you're going to be doing a lot of these in lab this week. So manual resistance exercises, us as the therapist being the source of resistance for the patient. And there's a lot of pros to it. There's some cons to it as well, but we can do it a lot of different ways. We can take the person through a full arc of motion or just a partial arc of motion while we give them something to pull against, something to push against physically. We can perform isometric, concentric, and eccentric contractions. So I can, have the person's elbow bent here, give them some resistance and have them try and pull back. And I want you to pull for 5 seconds and then relax for 5 seconds. Now pull for 5 seconds, relax for 5 seconds. That would be my eccentric or my isometric. I could also give that person resistance as they pull through that whole arc of motion, and just do that in the concentric direction, where I'm going to let go, let them straighten their elbow back out, give them resistance on the way up. Eccentrics, kind of the trickiest, but we can definitely do that. When we do eccentrics on a patient, we have to explain the goal of the exercise to the patient. And usually one of the easier ways to say it is just, I'm going to try to pull you back out of that position. I want you to resist me as I do it, but I need you to let me win. Because if the patient sees this as a competition and they're pulling back against you, then you're more doing an isometric or potentially a concentric. So they have to, even if they are strong enough to handle that challenge that you're giving them, to make it eccentric, they kind of have to give in to you pulling them out of that. Now, we don't want to hurt them, so we do need to use that eccentric with caution and only do it when the tissue is ready for that challenge. But it is easy to do as long as you give that patient that proper instruction that you have to let me win. I'm pulling you out of it. I want you to fight me while I'm doing that, but I still need you to give with emotion and let me make that muscle work eccentrically. And that's usually going to be a sub-max eccentric. It's not that it's the maximum ability that that person has oftentimes, but we're still trying to get some eccentric contractions to get some of the tissue damage and the tissue response that we're after, as far as stimulating some tissue repair and things like that with eccentrics that we don't see with the ISO or the concentric nearly as much. So this third bullet point, we can vary the angle a lot. When we look at lifting a dumbbell, when we look at lifting a barbell, when we look at lifting any other form of resistance, pretty much, we often are limited in the planes that we can do it in. And with manual, we can do things at all kinds of different angles. You know, I can take a dumbbell and I can try and bring my dumbbell across my body, but it's only challenging certain muscles in peak position certain times, and maybe it's putting some forces on certain joints that you don't want. But when we apply manual resistance to the patient, we can, the variety of motions that we can do is really great. And we can fluctuate how much resistance we're giving that patient to give them something stronger to pull against where they are strong, and then back off the resistance and make it easier for them to move when they're in kind of weaker points in their given arc of motion for whatever activity we're doing. So the ability to vary our resistance is a lot different than when we give somebody a 5-pound weight. It's always 5-pound weight, but we can vary how much force we're applying to that patient to match their resistance a little bit more effectively. We can do open or closed chain. It's certainly easier to do open chain with manual resistance, but we can do closed chain by getting, pushing on their body. Let's say somebody's doing a squat. I don't want to give them weight, but they can come down and I can push down on the top of their shoulders while they try and lift up. That would be a way to do a closed chain with manual resistance. But it's definitely easier to do open chain stuff with manual resistance too. We do have to think about, is that a good position for the patient, and is that going to be a good position for me? If I'm trying to be the source of resistance for a patient, I don't want to make myself vulnerable and put myself in a position where I might hurt my back, where I might hurt my knee, where I might hurt some body part because I needed to contort myself to give the patient the challenge where I wanted the patient to get the challenge. So you kind of have to take those things into consideration. It can be easy for us to stabilize one end of the muscle and then give them resistance at the distal end of the muscle. If you think about like our biceps brachii muscle test, where we brace the person here on the shoulder and then we pull down. If I'm doing manual resistance exercise, I can brace that person. This guy needs some muscle mass, I'll tell you that. I can brace that person here and pull down to give them eccentric, or let them pull up against me to give that concentric. Whereas if I don't stabilize here, now they're also kind of having to stabilize their scapula and engage some other muscles that we might not want to target necessarily. So this last bullet point is definitely important because we don't want to all of a sudden jump in with all our force. We're going to give this patient manual resistance. I don't want to all of a sudden just like try and yank their arm down. I want to kind of ease into it, see how they're tolerating it. If they're able to handle that resistance, then I can push or pull a little bit harder as they go through that motion. And then the huge advantage over something like a weight is that if they do have pain all of a sudden, well, I just take my hand away and I've taken away their source of resistance. Whereas they don't have to drop the weight, I don't have to take the weight from them. I just back off and the resistance is gone. So their manual resistance is nice that it's very safe and we are in control of a lot of things with it. So it has a lot of pros, and it's certainly great in a lot of settings where we don't have access to a lot of equipment. Like if you're in a patient's room in a hospital or a nursing home, like if you're doing home health and you don't have a full array of weights and other equipment, you don't bring a total gym with you to the patient's house, you don't bring a squat rack to the patient's house. So those are other times when manual resistance can be very helpful for us. So I kind of talked about some of those pros there as we went through those different components. There's definitely cons. We can't quantify how much resistance we gave the patient. I don't know if I was pushing against them with 20 pounds of force or 40 pounds of force or what. I can judge it in terms of minimal, moderate, strong resistance, but I can't really say that it's a given objective number. And that makes it a little bit harder to track progress because it's not, oh, they went from a 5-pound weight to an 8-pound weight. They went from yellow TheraBand to red TheraBand. Those are very objective, kind of tangible notes of progression, whereas, I was giving him more resistance today. We don't know how much more. So that's kind of a limited deal. The load is limited to the strength of the therapist. So if I'm, not as strong as the person that I'm trying to challenge, or maybe I'm trying to challenge their leg muscles with my arm muscles, they're probably going to win. And so it's hard for me to give them a lot of strengthening benefits, because if I can't give them enough resistance to push against, I'm not going to really see the adaptations, because I'm not going to overload them very effectively. Now, early on in the rehab process, that's not usually a problem, but later on, it certainly could be. If you're working with that high school, college ACL patient, and we're trying to give them manual resistance with our hands, that might not cut it for their quad or their hamstring. Manual resistance, there's a few manual resistance exercises that the patient could do themselves, but we are pretty limited because of just our own biomechanics of trying to give ourselves a lot of resistance. So I'm trying to do abduction. Well, I can go to about here, but now I can't really push very well with this arm. Whereas if somebody else is pushing down on you, they can vary their position a lot easier than one arm pushing against the other arm. And it is very time intensive. We pretty much can't be doing anything with any other patient while we're trying to do manual resistance training with the patient. It's other than a passive modality. You set up E-stim on one patient, you could go do manual resistance exercise on somebody else, but it's pretty hard to stay engaged and do much else when you're constantly cueing the person and encouraging movement and that kind of thing. Isometrics, we can do these sub-max or max. We can do them at varying angles so that we can challenge the muscle in different arcs of motion and help it improve and gain some strength in various positions. We do want to hold the contraction for a good amount of time. It's really hard for almost anybody to hold a good, strong isometric contraction for more than 10 seconds. A lot of times we'll use 5 seconds as kind of that cue for that patient that's recovering from surgery to try and engage and hold that contraction. Mentally, it's kind of hard to keep doing that when you're not moving. It's easier to push through reps and count reps than it is to hold something in position with really, really good muscle engagement and lots of motor recruitment for a long period of time. So EBP is evidence-based practice. So apparently there's a study out that said maximum benefit of isometrics is 20 reps a day for 6 to 10 seconds each rep, which could take a while. So we can do isometrics at a lot of times, and we can't do concentric and eccentrics, the more dynamic motions. If you're in a cast or a knee brace, you're going to have a lot of atrophy because you're not using that body part for whatever reason. Depending on where the person's injury was, whether it's a surgery or a fracture or whatever, you might be able to engage some of the muscles that are constrained within that cast and push and pull against the cast or the splint to actually be your force of resistance instead of actually pushing against somebody or some other object. Can definitely help with us reestablishing that neuromuscular control. And that's what we see a lot with those orthopedic patients that kind of lose the ability to fire their quads. And that's pretty common after like ACL surgeries and knee replacement surgeries. And so this is one of the first ways that we can do it. And you can combine it with Russian or another electrical current to try and help get more involuntary recruitment while the patient's actually trying to remember how to send those signals from the brain to the muscle that they're trying to activate. So isometrics can be very helpful with that. You can look at joint stability, and then we're not moving the joint at all. So if we have problems with, say arthritis, when we go through a given arc of motion that my knee hurts, I could still potentially do some strengthening at different static positions to get some strength and maintain some strength in those muscles. So different types of isometrics. I talked about quad sets earlier, and setting exercises are ones where the patient is just trying to contract a given muscle without moving anything. And quad sets, glute sets, and hamstring sets are probably the most common three that you'll hear about, but you could do sets of any muscle really. We usually have it in a somewhat lengthened position, and we're just asking it to engage and either push down against the surface or push against a solid object, whether that's our hands or whether that's some other contraption that you've got set up to block the patient's motion. So those are pretty basic, and these can be really good. You can do them at submaximal activity and then build into more maximal contractions. And these are usually our starters. And then we can move into doing stabilization exercises. So we've got this person here on the Bosu ball, and they're just holding that plank. And so it's making you stabilize. A plank by itself would be a stabilization activity because we're using lots of different muscles to hold that body position. But when we throw in this unstable surface, now we're getting a little bit more of what's called co-contraction. We're going to be getting muscles on both the agonist and the antagonist muscles for any of our given pairs at joints. We'll still have to be working because we've got this little bit of a wiggle from that rounded and soft Bosu surface that will then make us work those muscles not in a purely static position. There is going to be a tiny bit of variation as those joint angles change a little bit and I'm shaking, but you're still not really, it's not like you're doing push-ups on the Bosu ball. That would be a different thing. If you do push-ups while you're holding onto the Bosu like that, you're doing a dynamic strengthening exercise with an unstable surface. If we're just doing it for stabilization, then we would just have that person hold that position. And you might even like bump the Bosu to create a little bit more instability in it and give them a little bit more challenge, but we're still not asking them to move through any kind of arc of motion if that's the goal with that. So if we're doing isometrics, again, any more than 10 seconds and really somewhere between 5 and 10 seconds is probably ideal. With most patients, you're probably looking at if they can get to 5 seconds, they're doing pretty good. 10 seconds is a pretty long hold. We do see strengthening being very specific to the position that we did the isometric in. So if we're trying to gain strength throughout a full arc of motion, let's say 90 degrees of motion, then we need to challenge that muscle at about every 20 degrees. You're going to get strengthening about 10 degrees on either side of the position that you do. So if I strengthen somebody at 10 degrees of knee flexion, they're going to gain some strength at full extension and potentially up to 20 degrees of knee flexion from that activity. If I then did it at 30 degrees of knee flexion, then I'd be getting strengthening from 20 to 40. And so that's what you kind of have to think about. If I'm trying to help improve strength through this whole arc of motion, I can't just do it in like 2 positions and say I'm done. I would really need to do it at multiple distinct positions if I want to get strength isometrically throughout that whole arc. Usually it's going to be mechanical or manual resistance. You can set the person up to do mechanical, and this would be an example here. This guy pushing on the wall. Well, that's a mechanical resistance. The wall itself is what he's pushing against. Manual resistance would be I'm going to push against myself, or the therapist is going to push against me to be my source. But can be super versatile. There is a big tendency when you're holding those contractions for 5 seconds, for 10 seconds, for people to hold their breath. So we want to watch that and encourage them to keep breathing. If you see your partner today or Thursday, depending on which lab day you have, holding their breath with any of these things, remind them to keep breathing regularly and rhythmically. And because we do see that tendency for people to do a Valsalva and tense up a lot of stuff, we do have the potential to kind of cause blood pressure to shoot up a little bit, and especially if we're not keeping that breathing regular. So we want to be cautious if we do have those cardiac patients in particular. All right. Mechanical resistance is basically lifting weights. And it can be weights or it can be other forms of resistance too. Certainly body weight can be that extra resistance too in a lot of cases. So pros compared to isometrics, we can very objectively say, hey, they're getting stronger. We added 10 more pounds today with this exercise. We added 5 more pounds. They went up by 2.5 pounds. Super objective, easy to quantify. We can use those heavier loads. If I have that younger patient who I'm doing leg exercises with that I couldn't challenge them enough with my arms, well, throw some extra weights on there and you can give them a better challenge so they actually can cause some strengthening and adaptation. Can be really good for power, improving strength. You need a lot of equipment. That's our biggest kind of negative. And it's hard for patients to do some of these things at home because most people don't have this fully equipped home gym. We also lose control of the movement. We can't feel how capable the person is of generating resistance like we can if we're manually giving them that external force. So when we look at mechanical exercise or resistance exercise, we can look at either doing concentric or eccentrics, and hopefully y'all have a handle on the difference on those. These are just listing some of the things that are good or bad about concentric versus eccentric. They are distinctly different. With concentric, our muscles are generating more force than the load. That's why we're able to move it against that resistance. With eccentrics, the load is winning the battle and the muscle is having to lengthen to accommodate that heavier load. And that is believed what causes more of our tissue damage and more of our soreness. So we get more soreness and we get more gains really from the eccentric, but it is more inherently dangerous because it is more traumatic and harder on the tissues. So your book is fond of this term, dynamic constant external resistance, DCER. And this is what we think of as our traditional weightlifting. They used to use this term isotonic, and you will still see it used a lot to differentiate it from isometric. And it used to be within isotonic, you had concentric and eccentric. And people were like, well, you know, iso means the same, tonic means tone. So you're not, even though you're lifting the same weight, you're doing that 20-pound dumbbell and doing your curls, as you move through that full arc of motion, your muscles having to generate a variable amount of force because the joint angle changes, how much torque the resistance is creating changes. So your muscles are not generating the same amount of tone throughout that full arc of motion. So that's the book's rationale for moving away from it. You will still hear this term used a lot, isotonic, but that's what it means and why they don't feel like it's a great name for it. But it's sure a lot easier to say isotonic than it is to say dynamic constant external resistance. All right, then we have variable resistance. Resistance is going to vary throughout that arc of motion. And so if you think about TheraBand or our sport cord tubing, the more you stretch it, the harder it is to stretch it further. When there's not any tension on it, it's really easy to move. So elastic type stuff is going to get tougher and tougher the longer you stretch it. So it varies in resistance based on that length. And that property doesn't really match how our muscles are able to generate force most effectively. We tend to be kind of weaker at the ends of range of motion and a little bit stronger kind of in the middle, where we have kind of optimal overlap. So it has some pros and cons. And that's just for elastics. Now there are other type of variable resistance too. If you look over at the left, this picture here, this is what's called a cam, and it's kind of shaped like a kidney bean. And Nautilus was the first one that came up with this concept way back, probably like in the 60s or maybe the 70s. And the idea is that we've got this cable, and instead of just having a round pulley where you're going to have a constant transmission of force through that pulley cable system, when we use a oblong or oval shaped cam like this, as that thing pivots, how far away the cable is from the axis of rotation varies. In this position, it's kind of short. You know, here's my cable in this little groove, and let's say that's 6 inches. When I turn that thing sideways, and now that cable is in contact with the top, well, now it might be like 8 or 9 inches. And by changing that relationship from a physics standpoint, it changes how much force we have to produce to overcome that torque. So it does give you you can put it, you know, let's say that's on a machine that has weight stacks. I can lift 3 plates, but as I go through that arc of motion, that 30 pounds that 3 plates represents is actually varying in how much resistance I'm having to, or how much force I'm having to generate to overcome that resistance, depending on where that cam is in its pivoting arc of motion, because it changes that distance from the fulcrum, from the axis of rotation to where the force is actually being applied. It's great in theory. Most of the studies they've done looking at it says, well, these shapes don't really match the force curve of the muscle. Where the muscle is strongest doesn't really match where the resistance is the hardest. So I think it's a good idea, but I think they're not always shaped correctly. In the middle here, this is using hydraulic cylinders. And I have used some equipment like this that uses hydraulic cylinders. There's usually a dial, and it has, let's say, 5 or 6 settings on it. When you turn that dial to those different settings, it's going to change the diameter of the opening inside that cylinder. And there's usually going to be air or fluid or oil or something like that moving between 2 compartments. If I make that opening bigger, the fluid or the air can move more quickly, and it's not as challenging to move that piston up and down. If I tighten it down and make so the diameter is really, really small, then I vary the resistance because it's just harder to push fluid through there. Now you have to vary how fast you're moving too with those machines. If you have a really small diameter and you're trying to move quickly, it's really hard to do. It gives you a variable amount of resistance compared to if I had that same small diameter opening, but I was moving slowly and kind of matching the speed that the fluid was moving, then it might not feel really very hard. So you can, with that type of thing, to vary the resistance, you kind of have to vary that aperture, that opening size, but also how fast you're trying to move against that machine. All right, then we got isokinetics, which I wish we had one, but we don't. Isokinetic device is kind of like you see pictured here. You've got a big chair that you can set up in multiple positions. You can move these lever arms to the left to vary and work the shoulder, the elbow, the wrist, the knee, the hip, ankle, whatever body part you want. And it's all computer controlled so that it electronically brakes the machine. Not brakes like broken, but puts the brakes on. An isokinetic device, you set it for a certain speed and the patient moves against it. If they're moving slower than the speed that you have the machine set at, you won't feel any resistance at all. Once your limb speed matches what the speed of the machine is set at, then the machine will start to resist you. It won't let you move any faster than it's set for. And so you can push as hard as you want against it and generate lots and lots of force, and it lets you generate maximal force throughout the entire arc of motion without having to try and constantly manually change that resistance. So it is great. It's very objective. It tracks lots of data for you. You can print out fancy graphs and all that kind of stuff, but it's pretty time consuming to use. And it takes up a lot of space in a clinic, and they're also cost about as much as a new car. So they're kind of pricey for what you get for them. Most places that have them are places that are going to do a lot of research. And this is the type of device that they use to generate those eccentric versus concentric force production curves that Malia asked about earlier. All right, let's finish up with open and closed chain and make sure everybody's clear on these definitions. And then that's probably where we'll stop, I'm guessing. Is it at 34? So I got a little past halfway. So this is not Oklahoma City. For those NBA fans, it's open kinetic chain versus closed kinetic chain, okay? I personally think they could leave out the K, and then it could just be CC, kind of like my initials. That'd make it cooler, but that's also cubic centimeters, so I guess they can't do that. So open kinetic chain, the distal segment is free to move in space. So that's our tricep extension, our bicep curl, our knee extensions, our hamstring curls. Those are all open chain. The distal part of the limb is moving through space, pulling against the resistant force, pushing against the resistant force, whatever it is. When we do that, our adjacent joints don't have to do anything. I can stand here with my weight, not move my shoulder at all, not move my wrist at all, and just isolate my elbow as I do elbow flexion and elbow extension against resistance. So that's open chain. If we look at closed chain, our distal segment is fixed to that supporting surface, and it makes the adjacent joints have to move too. I can't isolate motion at one joint if something is truly closed chain. So if I'm doing my push-up, my hands are fixed to the surface that I'm pushing on. As I come in and bend my elbows, well, my shoulders are changing positions as well. I can't do a push-up by just bending at the elbow. I have to let my shoulders move too. Now my wrists don't necessarily have to move a whole lot. You don't think, but really you are. When you're doing a push-up on a stable surface, as you go down low, you're going into more wrist extension. And as you push yourself back up, you're going into more biased towards flexion. So you do have some differences at wrist position with that, even when your hands are fixed to a surface like that. So those two things are kind of the key thing. Is the distal segment free to move, or is it fixed? Does the motion that we're doing, can we isolate it to just one joint, or is it making other joints move too? And that's where this chain comes into play. When something is a closed chain, it means if I move one link in the chain, the other links on either side of it have to move too. If it's open chain, I can isolate the motion at just one link in the chain, and it doesn't affect the other links at all. So typically open chain are really good for isolating one specific muscle or muscle action, whereas closed chain, we're using multiple different things. If I'm doing a push-up, I have to use my scapular muscles, my shoulder muscles, my elbow muscles, my wrist and forearm muscles. All of those are going to help with that. You can do open chain exercises in standing, but if I'm doing upper body exercises, that's not really a factor. You know, the arms are still free to move through space. But typically with closed chain, you're going to be weight bearing, or you're going to be hanging from something. So if I do a pull-up, well, I'm not weight bearing, but my distal extremity is fixed. I'm holding on to that bar to do that pull-up. And when I do that pull-up, I have to move at all my different joints in my upper body to accomplish that motion. So that's kind of the exception, but most of what we think of with closed chain, we're going to be weight bearing. If I'm doing a push-up, some of my body weight is going through my hands. If I'm doing squats, deadlifts, lunges, any of those type of things, and standing for my leg muscles, those are all going to be closed chain. Typically, our load with open chain is rotational. We're moving through a given arc of motion, going from 0 to 90 degrees. That's rotational. Our load with our closed chain is more axial. we're loading the whole axial skeleton. If I'm doing a squat, yes, it's mostly for the muscles in my legs, but I'm having to engage and stabilize all those trunk muscles because I've got the weight sitting here on my shoulders. If I can't stabilize here, it doesn't matter how strong my legs are, I'm not going to be able to control that. So we're loading through the body, and that has more benefit for bone health and stimulating, laying down bone mineral and all those type of things. We do a lot more stabilization when we're doing open chain stuff because we're less worried about isolating and we're more engaging lots and lots of different muscles at one time. All right, there's some advantages, disadvantages. We'll maybe pick up there and start reviewing on that next time, and then we'll spend the rest of next week's lecture time on PNF strengthening techniques. But I think we got through a lot of what I needed to do to help make lab make a little bit more sense this week. So I'll see about half of you folks in about an hour, and the rest I will see tomorrow in lab. Johnny's wife tested positive, so Johnny's out of commission, I think, too. So it's pretty much just James and I running the show for at least the next couple weeks. So we have both gotten vaccinated, so hopefully neither one of us comes down with anything. So I'll see you guys, like I say, half of you this afternoon.
Do we need any books, Craig?
I don't think so. We'll be pretty active. Yeah, you got handouts, and so I think you're good.
Hey, Craig.
Uh-huh.
I was exposed again, so I won't be there today, but Tara is going to FaceTime me.
Okay.
And then I already got one negative test, but it was like 2 days after exposure.
Uh-huh.
Tomorrow will be 6 days, and so I'm going to get tested again. So if I test negative tomorrow, can I come to lab on Wednesday?
What my understanding of the policy is that you have to do the 14-day quarantine
Mm-hmm.
and test negative.
Okay.
So I don't even know that you need to get tested tomorrow.
Okay.
You just want to. I think from when I had to quarantine last semester, that was the rule that they had, that you had to observe the whole 14-day, and then
Okay.
the negative test result had to be beyond that 2-week window.
Okay.
So
then I probably won't be there for tomorrow or Wednesday.
Yeah.
But probably next Monday I should be good because it was, yeah.
Yeah, and have you been in communication with Kristen at all?
No, I have not.
Campus president. I think, I don't know if anybody else notified her. I don't know if Johnny did last week when we were kind of not sure if you needed to quarantine or not.
Yeah.
You might have, but I would probably reach out to her, and that way she can send you the official policy.
Okay.
So Kristen Whitaker, she should, if you just put it in Outlook, her name should pop up if you're in the school's system. She's the campus director, I think is her official title.
Okay.
All right.
I will give her a call.
All right. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks. Bye.